Stay up to date on the latest political news this election season for less. Visit inforum.news/port and get 3 months of unlimited access to our news network for only 99 cents a month. Subscribe now at inforum.news/port. This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. From heating our homes and powering our vehicles to cell phones, clothing, and medical equipment, oil and natural gas makes everyday life better. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Forum Communications Company is proud to be a part of the Trust Project. Learn more at thetrustproject.org. Welcome to Plain Talk and happy Monday to you. One of North Dakota's challenges going back, I think, to statehood has been attracting capital into the state. In fact, it's one of the reasons why we created the Bank of North Dakota was, because people from outside, they were using that sort of desperation for capital against us, and so we basically created a state-owned instrument of capital for ourselves. That struggle persists even to this day, and I think you see the legislature trying to handle it in a lot of different ways. We've created various incentives for investments in the state. We're now beginning to use the legacy fund to create investments. We're doing a lot of things like that. But one of the challenges is this type of investment into, I should say, investment into the type of industries that North Dakota has, which are carbon heavy. No other way to put it. Oil, coal, even agriculture. It's been tough. And there is a movement out there. You've probably heard about it. It's called the ESG movement, or environmental, social, and government. And essentially it's, because I don't want to be pejorative here, but it's a type of investing where the driving factor isn't necessarily just profit, but also ideology. I think maybe that's a fair way to put it. And what's happening is investment in North Dakota, again, a place that has long struggled to access capital, investment in North Dakota is being branded as not good, as negative even, because our industries here are so carbon heavy. So here to talk to me about that, because he just recently testified along with treasurers from other states, Utah and West Virginia. North Dakota State Treasurer Thomas Beadle, they just testified before the North Dakota Legislature's Interim Energy Development and Transmission Committee about this very issue. And Thomas, did I sum everything up right? Am I doing a good job of laying out the issue?
Absolutely. That's a very good primer on it. I don't know if I could add much more to that myself, so this is going to be a short interview.
But hopefully not. We're going to get to
some this is a deep and complex topic. You did a great job summing this up. This has been something that has been impacting North Dakota for a long time. As you mentioned, access to capital, being what's deemed as a flyover state, has often led us to be oversought or overlooked by the bulk of the investment capital around the country. So you look at states like California, New York, Massachusetts drive the vast majority of private equity, private investment dollars. Something like 93% of all private equity dollars is derived from or invested within those states. And so North Dakota has often looked at ways for how can we bring more of that invested capital locally. Even so far as, you get it close to Chicago, then that means getting it to Chicago will get it closer to Minneapolis, getting it closer to Minneapolis, get it closer to Fargo and help, divert money that way. And so we've been looking at how can we, drive private equity development into North Dakota. And over the last few years, we've seen some tremendous strides in that. We've seen, areas like the Grand Sky bringing international companies to do research and development there. We now have the Grand Farm project, that just signed a lease for property in Castleton to go forward and expand their autonomous farming research and development there. We have tremendous programs going on in the energy sector, being spearheaded by the EERC up in Grand Forks. It's now leading to projects like the Project Tundra carbon storage project that's in development. We've had tremendous enhancement and for enhanced oil recovery and trying to get capital going that way. However, at the end of the day, we still see that for a private business or an entity to get access to that capital, it's still very difficult for them to go out there and raise money. That's why the Aldevrons and the Dots Pretzels are few and far between around here. Just getting that access, getting that startup, we tend to rely more on traditional banking relationships in North Dakota banking and taking out loans as opposed to venture capital money. And so that's something that we've been trying to change. But one of the things that does often cause some headwinds for our industries, especially our big ticket industries of energy and agriculture, is this push coming from the coasts and coming from Europe about the social impact of investing, the environmental impact of investing, and whether or not that those investors' dollars are going to have a negative impact in their mind, or a negative perception, at least, in terms of whether or not they're being stewards to the environment, or whether or not they're fighting appropriately for human rights, and a bunch of vague goals that all sound pretty good, but they're ill-defined, and they're really not consistent across the market. And so this is something that also affects not just our institute or our companies and our institutions that operate here, but it also affects North Dakota as a state, because when we need to go out and issue bonds for road projects or something or whatever else, whether it's us or our local political subdivisions, then we're getting rated. We have a credit rating as a state. And so if we're starting to be rated in a negative light, then we're going to have a harder time getting access to capital for us as a state to do some of these larger projects.
So that's a really good point. So it's not just investment for or investment in our primary industries that drive our economy, but they're also saying, listen, if you want to get financing to build something that's not very controversial, a highway or something, it's going to cost us more, basically, to get that financing, because they're going to say, listen, your industries are carbon heavy and the headwinds are blowing against you because of the ESG movement. So therefore, your revenues are more suspect and it's going to cost you more. You're a riskier investment for us.
Absolutely. And right now we're seeing, at least in the U.S., most of the big financial institutions or the rating agencies like Standard & Poor's. Standard & Poor's came out with their first ever ESG credit indicator report for U.S. states and territories on March 31st of this year. So that's when they released their first ever state rankings. And they said very clearly on that this is not being used to create the credit score for North Dakota by S&P, but rather this is, some of the information that has come in after the fact, or this is kind of the side along tacked information. So at this moment, they're claiming that the ESG scores don't drive the credit score, but rather they're just another factor with it. But we're envisioning a time where we're seeing the headwinds coming towards us, where eventually that will indicate or direct some of our credit scores, and will have a negative impact there. We're seeing this already in Europe. European Union is pushing down ESG scores and trying to formulate those within the EU continent. We're also seeing a big push by the current administration to try to put more reporting on the forefront of the ESG. So they have to put that onto their statement of filing and financial statements and everything that they put with the ESG for different companies. They're trying to move that to the forefront so it's more front and center on all of these public disclosures, and trying to get it to be more prominent than it already is. But if you just look back to that S&P Global ESG Credit Indicator Report, the first ever of these credit scorecards for a state specifically on ESG, we did well in the social and governance stuff. Governance is how you're structured, if you look at it from a company perspective, it's do you have good leadership in place? Do you have a good board structure in place? Do you have proper executive compensation? All those factors that just make a company run. That's what the governance tends to look at. The social is, the social taxonomy issues can be things like labor and human rights. It can be things like how many, your workforce participation, or how many, what the demographics are in terms of an age makeup. Do you have a lot of impending retirements coming up? Do you have, some of those other issues? But it also is things like, does what you do have an impact on the social impact on people? So So in addition to the human rights, it could be, are you promoting diversity, equity, inclusion? Are you trying to reach certain social change laws? Like some folks have been putting gun control issues on social governance, and are you and they're staying away from gun manufacturers due to the S and the ESG. Things like that are often showing up in the social areas. And then environmental is the environmental stewards and how the environment impacts us. For North Dakota, we scored neutral in the S and the G. So they said from a social perspective, as a state, they had zero concerns with us. From the governance perspective, they had zero concerns with us. But on the E, we were moderately negative is how they phrased it. So we're a moderately negative E3, and what that was is saying that we are a climate transition risk. So they said that our state's employment in the mining and logging industry, our energy development for coal, oil, and natural gas, we have 3.7% of our state employment is in that industry as opposed to the national average of 0.4%. So we're significantly overweighted from a population directly working standpoint into that area. Plus, the vast majority of our exports are impacted by traditional energy development, whether it's in our agriculture production or whether it's in our oil and gas development. So a vast majority of our exports and then also our state revenue is highly weighted into those industries. So their argument is that as we transition away from fossil fuel development, and as the market goes towards green energy, that we're negative in North Dakota. And so they're now using that to say, hey, North Dakota, you are a climate transition risk, with kind of the end goal being, if we don't address that and we don't do more to on the climate change front and on the green energy front, then we're going to be moved to a negative rating, and that's going to affect us long term.
This seems very manipulative. And I guess, I mean, I'm struggling because on the one hand, I mean, the stated goals are things we all want, right? Like, I don't want the environment ruined. I want people to be treated with dignity and respect. That's what I want. I want the same things that they want. The problem is I'm really struggling with how they're promoting how we get. It's like they have codified their approach to things into the rules, and now they're telling us we're going to be penalized if we don't follow their rules. That seems really tough. Like, when did we get to have a say in this?
Well, and that's certainly what we're seeing a push by folks who, especially against traditional energy, have long opposed traditional energy, have been trying to get away from it because they think that it's a sky is falling scenario, and they think that we can immediately end dependence on oil and gas tomorrow, which is absolutely impossible. I mean, even if you change every car on the new lot right now to an electric vehicle, you're still going to have gas-powered cars out there for the next 30, 40 years. Just look at how many cars.
And by the way, where are we getting all the electricity for all those electric vehicles? As we drive up demand for power.
You've got to be plugging them into the power supply in the energy grid. And you can talk to our wonderful public service commissioners about how heavily reliant we are on coal and the necessity of that, because especially on a day when the wind's not blowing, we don't have storage for that energy right now. So you have to have that base load capacity there. But so we're seeing that this push by some of these folks that have long had disdain or hatred towards some of our energy production. And they've been trying to legislate it politically. They've been trying to ban it in their states, trying to ban it at their area. But what they've discovered is that the blue states that don't like this are not the ones that are producing it. So even if they restrict it within their borders, they can't restrict it elsewhere in the country. So then they went the route of trying to stop the transfer of it. So we had to sue the state of Washington over shipping of some of our oil to market because we were trying to get it out to the ports, and so they were trying to block our trains.
We sued Minnesota over coal-fired electricity.
Absolutely. So they've been trying to stop the transmission of that energy, and then they've been losing in the courts that way because they recognize the courts recognize that the individual states don't have that right to then restrict us getting our stuff to the market. And so then now they're saying, okay, well, if we can't restrict the production or we can't restrict the transmission of it, well, let's see if we can go in the back door and try to stop the financing and make it so it's less bankable on there. So you do that in one way by tax incentives or other stuff at the federal level to promote different energy service generation than what we're doing. But then you also then come in there and right when this administration took power, John Kerry went to a bunch of the banks and presented on Wall Street trying to leverage them and push them to debank fossil fuels. Secretary Yellen has similarly put some comments out there to Wall Street about that. And they've been trying to pressure the institutions on the back end to do this. And this is something that we've seen from Wall Street over the years, that there's a large push from certain sectors, certain stakeholders to do this. And now companies have been following suit. And a lot of them, are just playing lip service to it, and they're still investing in us. And others are starting to pull investments altogether. And so what I've taken a stance on, and what the two treasurers who I've had present to the EDT committee last week took a stance on, is let's make sure that we're focusing on, from an investment perspective, let's make sure we're focusing on the investments and the finances itself, and not some separate social factor, some separate political factor that seems to be changing with the wind. If you want to look towards like the EU right now, just Bloomberg News this morning had a report come out, because they've been the EU has been leading on the ESG stuff. They're a little farther along in terms of implementing some of these policies and protocols than we are. And they just came out and announced today that the social taxonomy, the S part of it, they still haven't been able to come up with an agreement on what some clear benchmarks are for this. So they've shelved it for the next few years while they work to figure this out. The E they came up with, but even there, they had a lot of countries and a lot of people push back, because before they finalized it, they then added gas and nuclear into their definition of green energy. So even there, the E tends to get fluctuated around a little bit, and there's differences of opinion on whether or not that criteria and benchmark should be met. So right now, even the countries that are farther ahead on this in terms of implementing this ESG criteria to restrict capital flow, even they're wishy-washy on what it actually means. And so my perspective and our stance as treasurers has been, let's make sure that we just focus on the financial metrics, because otherwise you're giving us constantly moving goalposts here. And that's not a way that we can properly be a prudent investor on behalf of the funds that we manage, on behalf of our state's finances. We need to have clear benchmarks, and the best benchmark we can have is maximizing returns.
Well, yeah, obviously. As a state, and we have, as you just alluded to, we have, a couple of irons in this fire. Obviously we have the fact that our industries are here, but also the fact that North Dakota has billions of dollars invested. And so ESG guidance is going to matter there, and just how we invest the legacy fund or our pension funds or et cetera, which obviously you're involved with. One of the things that really bothers me about this is that by going this route, right? Because again, I think we're all interested in doing better, right? In improving and cutting emissions and improving our environment. I think there's always room for improvement there, no question.
Absolutely.
The problem though is that if you starve off capital, where does the money come to? We're creating a situation where if we want to keep the lights on and the air conditioners running and the Tesla's charging, we got to have coal. Right? Yeah. And we got to have natural gas at a minimum. And we need nuclear too. So we need these things. But on the flip side, we're also going to deny capital so we can't A, build more of those things, or B, even invest in improving them, which, carbon capture has become an emerging industry unto itself in our state. And, the ESG move is impacting, I know it is because I've spoken with them, is impacting investment in those endeavors as well. So that's an effort to take our industries, and by the way, not just coal, but like ethanol. I just talked to the folks from Red Trail Ethanol, who just implemented a wonderful carbon capture project. It's deterring investment or making it more difficult to find capital for those things as well. That seems counter to the entire environmentalist part of this whole thing.
Well, and no company is more motivated to find solutions to capture the carbon and make sure that they avoid polluting than the energy companies themselves, because they want to look for their own longevity and their own future and protect that. And so right now they want to be investing in, alternatives for innovating their way out of the emissions issue. And I've heard some conversation about, maybe the E, instead of it standing for environment, should be more focused on just emissions. Because if we cut emissions and we're able to capture and then store the carbon down underground, which North Dakota's geology is uniquely wonderful for that,
right?
And we have tremendous opportunities to do that. Then these companies, if we can go that route, and we can get people to agree that capturing and storing these emissions is a good thing, then that'll open up another avenue for us. But the companies that want to do this are the ones that currently have traditional fossil development. They're rated off of their current production and looked at based on their current historical performance, not necessarily what they're going to do. And so they're being dinged by the market, even if they're trying to do more of the R&D going into some of the cleaner development or the capturing to lower emissions and make sure that the traditional fossil fuel plays are done cleaner and more safely. I mean, some of the biggest research coming out of this area is through companies like BP and Exxon and Continental and Marathon. I mean, these are some of the biggest companies in the world that are investing in trying to do research into cleaner methods of producing our energy in the country, but they're all being dinged by being traditional energy developers. And so that's something that just really is kind of circular logic when it comes to trying to direct the investment piece, because you're trying to punish them from taking more, steps in what most people view as the right direction. But if it's not all or nothing, then they're punished for it.
I also think of all the disasters that we have created by trying to manipulate the markets to get an outcome that we want. I mean, the most obvious example is probably the subprime housing crisis, where we tried to promote the idea of home ownership, right? We identified home ownership as being this desirable thing, and we could probably have a whole podcast about whether or not that was an appropriate conclusion. But we said we want more Americans to be homeowners, so we tried to manipulate the markets so that the investments would be in the right way, so more people, and the market collapsed. And I'm worried that we're doing the same thing to energy.
Well, even look right now, where we're the biggest, the two biggest factors that are impacting our economy right now seem to be inflation and labor supply chain issues. And so you had COVID shutdowns causing issues in the supply chain that have taken years to recover, because the supply chain was affected all around the world. And so then you try to ramp up production and you're not able to do that because the capacity is not there to build up that supply chain. And then you also have the governments who over the last 4 years, 2.5 years, have spent trillions of dollars trying to goose the economy across the world and trying to put more money back into circulation to try to stop the bottom from falling out when you shut down the economy. And now that's leading to inflation like we've never seen, because you just have all of this extra cash flowing into the market. And so that's areas where the government intervened, whether through restriction or through trying to goose it. And really, we're seeing the effects of it. I mean, that's why the Adam Smith invisible hand, that's the way that the markets operate most efficiently. It's just kind of behind the scenes, things just flow and let capital flow to where there's opportunity.
Also, that invisible hand is immutable. It exists whether you like it or not, and you can try to act on it and produce outcomes, but the market's going to do what it will. So you testified before a bunch of lawmakers, right? Mm-hmm. And obviously the question before North Dakota is, what can we as a state do about this? And I feel like there's something. I began the interview talking about the Bank of North Dakota, which was created to solve a capital problem for our state. And I feel like in a way we've already kind of gone that route, where we created the clean. Now I'm always forgetting the
Clean and Sustainable Energy Authority.
Clean and Sustainable Energy Fund, which I've been because other states are doing this too, and they've been calling those green banks, which is essentially piles of unfortunately public money. I would rather it all be private investment, but basically piles of public money that are there to invest in making industries green. And it's unfortunate. It's like in much the same way that we created the Bank of North Dakota to supply something that the private sector should have, but for whatever reason wasn't. Well, we've kind of done the same thing with Green Bank. What else can we do as a state to push back on this?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. The fact that we have the Bank of North Dakota puts us, uniquely situated to try to handle this sort of deal. And we've used them all across the history of the bank for different areas. The most shining example for that is just, rural communities have a hard time getting access to capital because there's no one there. If you want to buy a house in a rural community or start up a business in a rural community, you have, a hard time getting comps. You have a hard time finding financial institutions that have that much cash. To be able to put that's viewed as strongly risky, just because the whole labor and customer market are much lower. So we allowed the Bank of North Dakota to come in and underwrite risk and underwrite the loans in partnership with local banks in order to help put money into the rural markets. So we've used the Bank of North Dakota for generations now. to try to help with some of the problems that we uniquely face in North Dakota. But when it comes to ESG, there's a whole different area that we have to look at for this, the investment of this capital and how we can do this. Last legislative session, the legislature passed Senate Bill 2291, which was a prohibition on social investment. So you talked a little bit about the funds we manage at the State Investment Board and how we manage the assets that we invest on behalf of our North Dakota citizens. They put a prohibition to social investing, so into statute. So they're directing us by law as an investment board that social investing is the consideration of socially responsible criteria in the public funds. So if we're investing the funds for the purpose of attaining effect other than maximized returns to the state, we're not allowed to do it.
But one exception. But that's just for our state's investments, right?
Correct.
That has nothing to do with private markets.
Correct. And the one exception that they put in there for that investment piece is the in-state investment program through the legacy fund. So recognizing that directing capital just to be in-state, you're having fewer opportunities or options than you have versus a global market. So we might take a slightly worse returns.
We've always acknowledged that the in-state investment, the goal of that is not necessarily maximizing returns. The goal of that is benefiting North Dakota. So that makes sense.
Correct. So that area of our state invested funds can go towards investing in, bring capital into North Dakota. That was kind of trying to solve that long tail issue of struggling to get capital into state. The in-state investment piece that we're making strides in, we've got over $60 million deployed in that already, directly on the equity side, plus through Bank of North Dakota and the CD match program and some of the fixed infrastructure loan programs. We've got a couple hundred other $1 million through that program. That's making progress in terms of getting capital into our markets. That's something that as a state we've been able to do. But from our state invested fund standpoint, we're still trying to mature that. We found that for years we've been had a governance policy and model over the State Investment Board that's more like a large city fund as opposed to a state fund with $20 billion of assets in it. So we're maturing that. We're trying to make sure that we're better stewards in terms of if we're investing in emerging markets or how we're handling our proxy votes at board levels for when it comes to ESG considerations, and making sure that we're not investing our funds in institutions that are directly trying to destroy the energy production that we have going on in North Dakota, because that's counterintuitive to us as a state. So that's something that we've been able to do and that we're looking at doing. And that's something that when we had Treasurer Moore in particular from West Virginia testify, his state has a number of banking relationships. For every state that doesn't have the Bank of North Dakota has to have a private bank to put all their state's capital, to put all their cash. And so what they started doing, and 12 states have passed it so far, is they put legislation on the books so that the treasurer or whoever oversees the bonding portfolio for them is able to basically put out a survey from some of these institutions. They can find out how they're acting in certain areas. And Treasurer Moore just put 5 institutions on the banned banking list because they're actively going against coal and gas development, which is tremendously vital to West Virginia's economy. So they're trying to direct and fight back on this issue where they put their own state's funds. And that's something that we've seen elsewhere. And I know there's conversation in the legislative halls, especially during the EDT committee, about doing something similar to that here in North Dakota. The other area that we're looking at, and this is the approach that Governor Burgum's kind of been taking through his goal, promotion of the carbon neutral by 2030 by helping to capture the carbon and everything else, is let's try to get these companies, these rating agencies, to take a more global approach to North Dakota. So rather than just how they're rating the Rainbow Energy and the Coal Creek Station, let's see how they're rating that within the ecosystem of North Dakota. So if we're helping to offset and store carbon for a vast majority of these companies, and we're helping to promote these other areas, then our other companies that operate in this environment might be able to be better treated on the public markets because they're operating within a global ecosystem of North Dakota, global ecosystem that is better and treated more fairly from the rating agencies.
The response to this is not the environment doesn't matter or that climate change is a hoax. That's not, and I understand that's such a fraught debate, and there's been so many wild claims made about that turned out to be not true. A baseline, though, the reality is human behavior impacts the environment. Unleashing all this carbon that was buried down underground in the form of oil and natural gas, and even wood that we've used, and all of this stuff, we're releasing carbon into the air. It makes sense to try to get it either not release as much or get what we're releasing and putting it back down underground. That makes a lot of sense. Our argument is not against the environment. Our argument is, listen, you guys have such a blinkered view of this. It's such a narrow, there's only one path to this. And we're saying, no, there are many paths to this. We have some pretty good paths here in North Dakota. Please don't punish us for this.
We've always supported in North Dakota innovation over regulation, and the only way you can have innovation is if you have capital to go into that research and development of that new technology. All we've been saying in North Dakota is, from the ESG standpoint, is we want the financial metrics, and whether or not it makes fiscal sense, we want that to matter more than a politically driven ideology, especially a politically driven ideology that seems to be changing with the winds constantly, as we're seeing with the EU trying to formulate and codify ESG metrics, that they can't come to agreement on it, and they've been battling it over years. So it constantly is an evolving nature for it. We would rather make sure that just the metrics make sense. We have over 4,000 megawatts of wind capacity production in North Dakota. We're a top 10 state for wind production. We're a top 10 state for ethanol production. We're not and we've got hydrogen projects in development here in North Dakota as well. We're not opposed to looking at these other methods of energy production, the other methods of being good stewards for our environment, but we recognize the fact, and I think we're the only ones being honest with the fact, that you have to have baseload capacity there that's always available, and that's where coal and gas and oil have always been playing a role into our energy infrastructure, coal and gas into our grid, oil into our transportation industry, and you have to have that capacity there. And we're the ones that are being honest with the fact that we need this production.
Right.
Let us get it to market. Pipelines are more efficient. They're cheaper and cleaner than rail or truck. So let us do pipelines and stop trying to fight us on that, especially if we're going through lines that are already brownfield development and have other transmission lines alongside them. Don't fight us on that, because that is the best way to get it to market. And this needs to happen. And so we're being honest about that. And so we know that takes capital. We know that takes resources to do that. And so we're trying to make the case out there that this has to happen. Yes, we want the innovation. Yes, we want the clean air. We want the clean water. We want to make sure that we have good outdoor resources to pass on to the next generations who want to be able to get out there and hunt deer and hunt pheasant and go and splash around in the lakes. We want to make sure they're still able to do that for generations to come, and that the environment's taken care of for that. But we can't put our head in the sand and ignore the fact that we need baseload energy production. We need to have energy hitting the global markets and hitting our local markets, because that's just a fact of life.
If the goal is structuring our investments so that they're in line with our very real need to improve the way we do industry, then I'm okay with that. But if the goal is to manipulate the capital markets to produce so that we're only dependent on certain types of industry over other types of industry, then that's a problem. And that's what really worries me. It feels like a lot of this is just solar, wind, good, coal, nuclear, gas, bad. And that to me that's not even environmental. To me, that's crony capitalism. That's
100%. That's terrible economics, and that's terrible policy, because they also don't want to then address with how do you recycle the old turbine blades, or how do you with the old solar panels,
rare earth,
you're putting
the rare earth stuff that a lot of the world's deposits of that are in some not so great places, mined in some not so responsible ways.
Yep. And that's something that they don't want to be real with, is if we're having to get all those rare earth elements from China or Venezuela, then we have problems with how sustainable and how good that's going to be long term for us. So that's also where doing the research and the innovation, let's do research on our coal supply, and can we pull some of these rare earth elements out of there? Can we leverage some of the resources that are there to get us to the next phase of that?
Things that require capital. Hey, let's figure out how to make this coal plant emit less carbon. Hey, you know what that takes? Capital. Quit starving us for it. So anyway, well, Thomas, I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate you coming on and talking about this. It's as you said, it is a deep and complex issue, but also in a way not that deep and complex, right? Like let's not limit ourselves to just one set of solutions. Let's have lots of solutions on the table to improve things everywhere. Because if I tell you what, if we try to narrow it down and just try to get one solution out of this thing, we're going to hurt ourselves. Thanks so much.
We always like more tools in the toolbox, and if folks want to see more about what was presented at the Energy Development Transmission Committee, it's all online. Treasurer Moore from West Virginia, Treasurer Oaks from Utah were great assets to that and have really helped lead this charge on the national stage. So we were grateful to have them here in North Dakota for that.
Thomas, thanks for your time.
Thank you, Rob.
Did you know Forum Communications Company has a robust podcast library? At inforum.com/podcasts, we have everything from politics, sports, true crime, outdoor adventure, and more. Visit inforum.com/podcasts and explore them all today.